Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Paul Horan. I'm an Assistant Professor of Intellectual Disability Nursing in Trinity College Dublin, and I'm also Chair of the Civic Engagement Committee. I'd like to welcome you all this afternoon to the second in our Tell Me About lecture series for 2023-24 academic year. This afternoon's talk will talk about adult safeguarding, building a human rights perspective, and will be delivered by my colleague, Professor Amanda Phelan, Professor in Aging and Community Nursing at the School of Nursing and Midwifery in Trinity College Dublin. Amanda is a Professor in Aging and Community Nursing in the School of Nursing here in Trinity since March 2020. Prior to this appointment, she was an Associate Professor in Nursing at the School of Nursing and Midwifery and Health Systems at University College Dublin, UCD. At UCD, Amanda was Director of Gerontological Programs and Deputy Director of the National Centre for the Protection of Older People in TCD. Amanda leads Ireland's only MSc-level multidisciplinary programme in adult safeguarding and has teaching areas in programmes related to community health, dementia, gerontological nursing, and advanced practice. Amanda has a research interest in safeguarding vulnerable populations, particularly related to older people, older persons' care, missed care, public health, and community nursing. Amanda is Vice President of the All-Ireland Gerontological Nurses Association and a member of the Board of Directors in Third Asian Safeguarding Ireland. Amanda has published 2 edited books on the topic of elder abuse, and her third co-edited book is on the area of gerontology. She's currently working on a book on community-centred care. Amanda has numerous peer-reviewed publications and sits on the editorial board of the Journal of Elder Abuse and Neglect and the International Journal of Older People Nursing. Her presentation this afternoon will consider the impact of a human rights-based approach within the area of adult safeguarding. The recently implemented Assisted Decision-Making Act will be reviewed in the context, and limitations in our current response systems will also be discussed. Amanda, I wish you every success with your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Paul, and welcome to all of you who are here or on Zoom. And it's wonderful to have an interest in this topic, particularly as tomorrow is National Adult Safeguarding Day. So just moving on to the first slide. What do we mean by adult safeguarding? It's really protecting a person's right to live in safety, free from abuse and neglect. And that's the definition under the England and Wales Care Act. If we look more locally in Ireland, Safeguarding Ireland and the Department of Health would see a similar definition, which really reflects that idea of living safely, free from abuse, and it means that people's choices are heard and respected. And this is really, as a society, it is all our business to make sure that everybody's human rights are respected. Just to review on what exactly we're talking about when we talk about abuse, we're talking about the usual suspects that we would think of, like physical abuse, emotional or psychological abuse, sexual abuse, financial and material abuse, neglect, and in Ireland we also see serious cases of self-neglect as under our safeguarding services. Other forms of abuse are digital or online abuse, and we also have abuse which is at an institutional level, at a discriminatory level, and this includes human trafficking and modern slavery. Human rights abuses can also occur in war times, in public health emergency situations, under political regimes, such as dictatorships in particular, and structural hierarchies, for example, the caste system. And this allows the system, political system and the societal system to treat people as others. They're not quite the same as ourselves, so therefore they're not able to enjoy the same human rights as the dominant class. More recently, we can see abuse within institutions as resident-to-resident abuse and peer-to-peer abuse, and there's a growing amount of literature in this area. You're all familiar with scams, so there are various perpetrations of scams which have become more sophisticated over time. So we can see romance scams. There's someone approaching you and falling in love and then saying, I've had an accident and I need €2,000, and then that goes on and on. Similarly, we see mate crimes, and you may remember a very serious case some years ago in the UK about Stephen Hoskins, a gentleman with intellectual disability, who was ultimately murdered by people who were his mates, inverted commas. There's lottery scams, fake company representation. There's phishing, which is fraudulent solicitation of email on a website. You have people who cold call. There's mail scams, investment scams. There's mule accounts. There's fake charity frauds. And this is the tip of the iceberg. There are many other ways that people will try and extract money from you. And when we think about rights, the main point is that every single citizen, every single person, by virtue of their humanity, are rights bearers. That means they're entitled to equal rights, regardless of their dependency, cognitive, functional ability, or regardless of their status. When we signed up to various rights declarations and conventions in Ireland, what we're actually saying is we are supporting this idea of equality, autonomy for people to make decisions, and various rights that are ascribed to particularly the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. So we look at just what the definition of abuse is. So this is any act or failure to act which results in a breach of a vulnerable person's human rights. And again, in the last 20 years, when you look at definitions of abuse around the world, increasingly it has used the lens of human rights and civil liberties. And here you can see that it includes things like physical and mental integrity, dignity, general well-being, whether intended or through negligence. So the issue of intent, it's the outcome that is the issue. If abuse occurred, it doesn't matter if it was intended or not. It could be through negligence. And that can include sexual relationships, financial transactions, to which the person does not or cannot validly consent. For example, somebody who has dementia, or somebody who has an intellectual disability who doesn't have decision-making ability or capacity. And it also includes acts which are deliberately exploitative. So just a review, what makes people risky? People can go in and out of risk over time, and it's important to remember that all of us during our lives can become vulnerable to abuse. Most of the research in terms of risk factors has been done in older person care. So we can see that there is an association with cognitive or mental capacity, dependency on others, low self-esteem, previous history of abuse, negative experiences of disclosing abuse, social isolation, and lacking access to health and social services. But Pillemer in the US and colleagues looked at the literature which identified risk, and they would say for older people, there's strong evidence in terms of that physical or functional ability, poor physical health, cognitive impairment, poor mental health. Potentially, risk is related to gender, age, financial dependency, race, ethnicity, were considered particular risk potential factors. For the perpetrator, there's strong evidence if the perpetrator has a mental health issue, a substance abuser, or dependency of some sort. This was strongly associated in terms of abuse occurring. And also the quality of relationships, marital status were viewed as a potential risk. And geographical location also influences the risk for abuse. Contested, and this simply means we believe that it may contribute, but more evidence is needed to support it. And that would be things like ageism, the negative stereotypes of older people, and cultural norms. So now we move to human rights, and in a book chapter that myself and Patricia Ricker-Clark wrote in 2020, we looked at human rights in terms of how they evolved over time and how they looked at the moment. So we identified 3 distinct generations of human rights involvement, and the first generation really can go back to 1755 BC with the Code of Hammurabi, where they identified in Persia, in Babylon, that there were rights available to various people. And it was the first time this idea of the presumption of innocence for a crime was identified. Then we can move on to Cyrus Cylinder, which is pictured here. And this is from Persia, Cyrus the Great, who freed the slaves and also identified racial equality and freedom to choose your religion. The second generation moves a couple of hundred years later, because we can see the tracing of modern day human rights in things like the Magna Carta, the Petition of Rights, the US Constitution, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, and the US Bill of Rights. And our more modern ideas of human rights really evolved from post-World War II and the Nuremberg trials, where we saw the atrocities that were perpetrated on individuals in the Second World War. And Eleanor Roosevelt, who is here, was the chair of the committee that produced the UN Declaration on Human Rights. And what's interesting is that there were many countries who signed up at that point in time, and it has expanded. It's actually transcribed into over 500 languages at this point. However, this was not legally binding at that point. People signed up to it, but there was no legal binding, although various publications after this would acknowledge that they adapted this within their local laws. So we're really looking at generation 3 when we're thinking about current day influences of human rights. And when you ask people about human rights in Ireland, they tend to think of it as something that's not quite applicable in Ireland, because we have a democracy. People can engage in, they can go where they want, they can say what they want, and etc. They tend to go back and they talk about wars or, things like the Nuremberg trials, or other countries where there is dictatorships or there's a state of unrest. But in fact, human rights are in every small encounter we have every day. And we look at that. In Ireland, we can see that human rights are firstly enshrined in Bunreacht na hÉireann from 1937, our constitution. And also Ireland draws upon the European Union, the Council of Europe, and international human rights laws in terms of guaranteeing citizens' human rights. So if we look at Bunreacht na hÉireann, we can see in Article 43 that guarantees its laws to respect and, as far as practicable, by its laws defend and vindicate the personal rights of the citizens of Ireland. And you can see here it's saying that it vindicates the life, the person, the good name, property rights of every citizen. Furthermore, no citizen shall be deprived of his personal liberty, saved in accordance to law. And the dwelling of every citizen is inviolable and shall not be forcibly entered, save in accordance with the law. And this is one that we respect. However, it can be a challenge in adult safeguarding, because unlike child protection legislation, we do not have any legal right to enter into someone's home if there is a suspicion that they're being abused in that house. We do if it's a child, but not for an adult. And this is one of the gaps that we lack adult safeguarding legislation. And we also see the right of citizens to express freely their convictions and opinions. Also, Article 45 places an obligation on the state to promote the welfare of the whole person and securing and protecting as effectively as it may a social order in which justice and charity shall inform all the institutions of national life. Again, we can see it places a duty on the state to safeguard with special care the economic interests of the weaker sections of the community, and when necessary, to contribute to the support of the infirm, the widow, the orphan, and the aged. So the language used in the Constitution is reflective of the language that was commonly used in 1937. if we were to rewrite this, I would imagine that the terms and language would be slightly different. And then we see that the UN Convention on Human Rights, the 30 articles here really promote what we take for granted in everyday life. However, if you dig a little deeper, you can see that some of these rights can be breached in everyday life. So we look at, I'm not going to go through the 30 articles, I'm sure you're delighted to hear that, but the right to food and shelter, the right to an education, the right to own private property. So some of these rights, while we have signed up and said we are supporting the convention, when you look at their operationalization down in the country, down in the towns, down in the villages, down in communities, these are not always supported fully. And Ireland ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities in 2018. And we were the second last country in the European Union to do this. Again, you can see that it's very familiar in terms of the rights that are allocated to individuals and citizens, but it was felt that a particular convention for the rights of people with disabilities was necessary. So the generic UN Declaration on Human Rights, while we supported that, for children, we also have a Convention on the Rights of Children, and for people with disabilities, that it was necessary to identify that there were particular issues in the context of those populations that needed further support in terms of the vindication of the rights and to support people to claim those rights. And when we look at the rights of persons with disabilities, what we're looking at is a reorientation. The Convention puts forward a social model of disability, and the level of accommodation made by society determines the degree to which a person's impairment becomes a disability. So we've moved away from the disability to say, how can we create an environment that is more equitable? And this is a lovely representation of that in terms of respect, the right to life, and so forth, that I came across from the Disability Law Centre. And Ireland has also subscribed to several other rights conventions, so the rights of the protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms from the Council of Europe, the European Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and as I said, that was ratified in 2018 on the 20th of March. We also in Ireland have the European Convention on Human Rights Act, which supports the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, Employment Equality Acts, the Equivalent Status Acts, and more recently, the Assisted Decision-Making Capacity Act, which reformed the Lunacy Regulation Act of 1871. It was very archaic, and you may know this through the wardship approach. That was directly under the Lunacy Regulation Act. Currently, the Assisted Decision-Making Capacity Act was fully signed in December of 2022, and it was enacted in April 2023. So anybody who is a ward of court currently, over the next 3 years, those wards of courts will be reviewed by the courts and transferred under the Assisted Decision-Making Capacity Act. So when we think about rights, what do we mean by that? Well, rights are inalienable, indivisible. They reflect equality, dignity, and they're interdependent. That means that they stand alone. You cannot divide them. They're all interdependent on each other. But the barriers in society are numerous. So things like stereotypes, so ageism, how we think about older people and how we treat them, disableism, paternalism, power dynamics, people who have dependencies, how we treat those and vindicate their rights. There's also issue with a lack of knowledge of people about their rights, because if you don't know what your rights are, how are you going to claim them? And there's also a lack of knowledge in terms of a human rights-based approach. If people don't know what the principles of human rights are, how are you going to support systems of care or decision-making, which is underpinned by a rights-based approach? And also our societal norms, we need to reflect on those and see, are they actually vindicating rights, or are they a barrier to rights? So we're just going to take a short break now and show you a video. 75 years ago, we had the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and Human Rights Day is the 10th of December. So I'm just going to play this.
75 years ago, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights made humanity a promise: equality, freedom, and justice for all. There has been immense progress since then, but there's also so much left to be done. We look to you to keep using your voice and to take action to create the world we want and that we so desperately need. As we count down to 10 December, Human Rights Day, tell us what pledges you want to see to make human rights a reality for all of us. Human rights should be everyone's normal, every day. A world without war, without discrimination, where everyone has a say, everywhere, no matter what. The time for human rights is now.
It goes on and on. So when we look at the rights being indivisible, we're also looking at things like how people's individual awareness of human rights is supported. What legislation and policy have we underpinned with the principles of human rights? And certainly a lot of work needs to be done here. And what supportive structures and facilitators in terms of things like education, societal public awareness, in terms of all of us taking a role in vindicating rights and not seeing it as a government's job simply, or an organisation or an institutional right. So then when we look at human rights and we see all those articles, how do we actually apply it? A human rights-based approach means that we integrate this into all our policies, our orientations, our legislation. And it is how are we making meaningful and inclusive participation for everyone, and that everybody has access to decision making, which reflects their will, preference, values, and beliefs. So it's non-discriminatory. It doesn't matter if you're somebody who's living with dementia in a nursing home, or you're somebody who is living in a rural part of Ireland. Everybody has to experience human rights equally. And if they are breached, that there is accountability and there's a rule of law for all. There has to be transparency and access to information supported by disaggregated data. And the interventions that are needed are to enhance duty bearers, and that's everyone who supports human rights, that they have an ability and they have an orientation to meet obligations and facilitate rights holders to know what their rights are, to assist them to claim those rights and to enjoy those rights. And of course, when we're looking at supporting people who have difficulty, for example, in decision making, we need to ensure that the processes we have in place are proportionate to responding to those rights. So a human rights approach puts people first and promotes human-centered development, recognises dignity of every human being without distinction. It promotes equality between men and women, equal opportunity and choices for all, national and international systems, and also this idea of economic equity and equity in access to public resources, social justices, and mutual respect between people. And if you think about really that statement deeply, you can start to identify the fractures or cracks within our system where all people don't have economic equity. All people don't have equity and access to public resources and social justice. And we can see pockets within our society, people who are marginalised. And therefore, when people are marginalised, the level of respect can be reduced. So the conditions of possibility are the person's physical and mental health condition. How can we assist this? We do, under the Assisted Decision-Making Capacity Act, it's our obligation now to assume that somebody has the capacity to make that decision unless proved otherwise. And this isn't proved through a cognitive test like a medical mini-mental score examination or the MOCA test. This is a functional approach to capacity, and there are various steps that must be taken, even if the person has a diagnosis of living with dementia, or even if the person has intellectual disability. You always approach that decision and assume the person is capable of that decision unless proven otherwise. So you look at what does that person then need to communicate? Are there other aids that might be available to help that person understand and communicate? So communication boards. If someone is deaf, how can you maximize their understanding? So you look at the person's previous experience or lack of experience in making decisions, the involvement of others who have their will, preference, values and beliefs as a core aim in supporting that person. Being aware of the possibility that that person may be subject to undue influence. And that has happened in terms of leaning on people to make wills in various ways, or undue influence to make decisions. Even if we think that that decision is the best decision for that person, we can't influence the person in terms of, saying, well, there's no other decision for you, you should do this. Because that person has to weigh it up themselves and say, what is best for me? So they have to be beyond duress or coercion regarding that decision. And you look at situational, social and relational factors. And Ireland is becoming more and more multicultural. So that lens of cultural, ethnic and religious factors come into play, and the cognitive factors I've talked about before. Emotional behaviour factors and those related to various symptoms of diseases or disorders should be taken into account. And looking at the decision, when is it being made at the time of the day? Some people may be more sleepy at a particular time of the day and more alert at another time of the day. So then that's when they should be making their decisions. So looking also at the effects of prescribed drugs and other substances. So when we talk about that functional approach to decision-making, it's the process of making decisions for oneself or extending that power to another individual when it is impaired. And we know under the Assisted Making Capacity Act that this is, if somebody is so impaired that they don't have decision-making capacity, they then can appoint through the courts a representative decision-maker. And the functional approach is for the person to understand the basic facts, appreciate the personal impact of the decision, including one's capabilities and limitations, have a reasoning process for comparing the options and predicting the consequences of alternative choices, and be able to make a choice and communicate that choice to somebody else. But it doesn't end there. Our responsibility does not end there, because once somebody makes a choice, we have to see, how do we make this happen? So the executive capacity is the process of putting one's decision into effect, either alone or by having people who are delegated to articulate and operationalize that decision. So it means having a predetermined plan to operationalize the decision, adapting the plan in response to changing or unexpected circumstances, delegating these responsibilities to appropriate surrogates when one is physically unable to carry out the plan. And then there have been various frameworks which have been developed to help us look at what we do in terms of a human rights-based approach. And the Scottish Human Rights Commission have advanced this quite significantly, and they have developed the panel. So this is participation. Has the person participated in the decision? Accountability. Are we holding ourselves accountable? Non-discrimination, equality. Are we treating everybody the same? Empowering that person to make the decision, giving them the options, making them aware that it is truly their decision and that decision should be reached authentically, and looking at the legality of that decision. And more recently, the World Health Organization have also added an S after the legality, and this is to reflect sustainability, because the Sustainable Development Goals are very much about making decisions which are sustainable. Also, the Scottish Human Rights Commission have looked at a framework called FAIR, and this lets us look at the facts of the decision. What is the experience? Is the individual being heard? What are the important facts to understand? The analysis of the rights that are at stake, the identification of shared responsibilities, and reviewing the actions. And the advantage of the FAIR approach is that not only do you see if that decision is right at that point in time, but there's an obligation to come back and review the actions at a separate point in time. In Ireland, we have adopted the FREIDA principles, and this was published in a report by Safeguarding Ireland and the Health Information and Quality Authority in 2019. And the FREIDA principles are fairness, respect, equality, dignity, autonomy. So again, in decisions that are being made, we ask ourselves, is that decision fair? Is it equitable treatment for all individuals? Does it demonstrate respect and valuing of the unique perspectives and choices of that person? Equality is equal opportunities for all and vindicating their rights. Dignity is preserving individual worth and self-respect. And finally, autonomy is supporting independence and decision-making. So this is all aligned when we talk about person-centeredness. My experience in terms of talking to people about person-centeredness, they'll talk about it, but they don't truly understand it. And because people don't understand it properly, it can impact how it's operationalized in the care we might give, for example, in healthcare. So person-centeredness has emerged within the space of health, but when we look at the core principles, they're intrinsically linked to the wider concepts of rights, autonomy, and self-determination. Where there are decision-making challenges, many states have progressed legislative protection, and this includes Ireland, preserve and facilitate an individual's will, preference, values, and beliefs. So by our signing of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and our Assisted Decision-Making Capacity Act, these are legislative imperatives that reflect human rights, and they reflect the idea of somebody's will, preference, values, and beliefs. And then the question that sometimes I'm asked a lot is, you know, what if that person is making an unwise decision? What if that decision is risky? Well, people have the right not to be treated as lacking capacity to make that decision, because all of us make unwise decisions every day. You might decide to cross the road when the green man is not there. So everybody has their own values, beliefs, and preferences, which may not be the same as those of other people. So we're then looking at the idea of supporting that decision, but orientating our support towards positive risk, which involves taking carefully considered risks that create positive outcomes for the service user, such as improved well-being and the promotion of independence and dignity. It's about thinking outside the box to support that person. So are there practical steps that you can take to enable the person to manage that decision in a more safer circumstance if you think that decision is quite risky? And the Courts of Protection in England have recently quite interesting commentaries in terms of supporting decisions of people, that human rights approach. So when they talked about risky decisions, this is Lord Justice Munby, and what he says is the emphasis must be on sensible risk appraisal and not us trying to create a sterile existence where somebody who we think is vulnerable can't make any risky decisions. But what we do instead is seeking a proper balance with being willing to tolerate manageable or acceptable risks as the price appropriately to be paid in order to achieve some good, in particular to achieve the vital good of the elderly or vulnerable person's happiness. And what he ends with is, what good is it making somebody safer if it merely makes them miserable? And he is commenting on a lady who was admitted to a nursing home who promptly engaged in withdrawal and died, because that's not where she wanted to be. And a lot of nursing homes are really good environments. But if you ask a lot of older people where they want to be, they want to age in place. They want to be in their own community. So moving someone to a nursing home when that's not what they want is actually a way of making them miserable. And what Justice Munby is saying, we should be concerned with people's happiness and supporting their decisions in that way. So when we look at supports in decision-making, the human rights are conceived really as tools that allow people to live lives of dignity, to be free, and is intricately tied to that idea of equality, and that people are able to exercise choices that are meaningful to them and pursue their life plans. And on foot of the Assisted Decision-Making Capacity Act, this transforms the way that we approach people. It's not, this is the decision and it's a yes or no answer. It is about providing that information in an understandable way, but breaking that information down. So, for example, an older person who's being discharged home, who lives alone. If you fall at home, what's going to happen? Who's going to support you at home? So you're actually letting them think about the consequences of that decision. And if they appreciate all of those consequences and the impact of that decision, then we support their decision. Facilitating communication, remembering this is about the person, not about what anybody else wants. Be aware of the influences, for example, coercive control, culture, gender, undue influence. If somebody is listening more and saying, oh, I have to go into a nursing home because my family can't mind me anymore, that means that, in fact, that may not be their independent decision because they're basing their decision on what somebody else wants. Allow time for someone to digest that decision and breaking it down into easily understood language. Lobby, be active in lobbying for people's rights. Independent advocacy, for me, is a core instrument that we need to put on a statutory basis in Ireland so that people have access to somebody who can independently come in and speak about their rights, what are their choices, and assist that person to lobby for claiming their own rights. And also remember that a lot of human rights breaches are also breaking the law. So if there is a breach which represents a crime, then that should be reported to the police. I mentioned the Advanced Decision-Making Capacity Act, and there have been amendments to the power of attorney. And also the Advanced Healthcare Directive has been given more status. So these two instruments can be used if somebody does have capacity. And unfortunately, both of them are hugely underused in the Irish environment. So we need to push people to think about advanced healthcare directives, but also power of attorney, because we don't know if you walk out your door tomorrow and you're run over by a car, you may end up with decision-making capacity challenges. And in that way, you'll have chosen someone with the enduring power of attorney to be able to manage your affairs. And you have the luxury of choosing somebody that you trust at that point. It doesn't need to kick in unless that decision-making capacity challenge occurs. However, if capacity is or will be impacted in the near future, for example, a diagnosis of dementia, then we need to think about putting the assisted decision maker arrangement in. And this is somebody who will assist you, gather the information, discuss that with you, and will help you to make a decision. The decision lies with you. We have a co-decision maker who does the exact same thing, but that co-decision maker is co-making that decision. It's a joint decision. And for people who don't demonstrate functional capacity, we have representative decision making. And that's where somebody will act according to your will, preference, values, and beliefs. And it was interesting when the language was being used here. The Mental Capacity Act in the UK uses the term best interests. The Law Reform Commission in Ireland decided not to go down that line because it could be debated whose best interest is that decision. Also, you may read some of the literature that they talk about substitute decision makers. Again, language matters because substitute decision makers may assume the decision lies with me. But when we talk about a representative decision maker, it means I am here representing you. That means the decision should reflect your will and values and preferences, not my best interests or not what I think independently as a substitute to make that decision for you. So you can find more information on that act, particularly on the decision support website in the Mental Health Commission. And finally, just to go back to Eleanor Roosevelt, who chaired the Declaration on Human Rights in 1948, what she says Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? And it is in those small places that we come in contact with every day that are close to home, so close and small they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. And what she argues, if we don't get it right there, unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. Without concerned citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mandy. That was excellent. I have a keen interest in the area because I myself work in the field of intellectual disabilities. Just got one question with regard to the presentation and maybe for the audience, and that is, are there any other specific safeguarding resources that you would direct member of the audience to?
Yes, of course. So you have the Decision Support Service in Mental Health Commission. You can also look at the array of information that's on Safeguarding Ireland, and I'm one of the directors in that organisation. They have been in operation since 2015, and they were set up post Ars Attracta because of the concerns about the challenges that were in that institution. So you can also make complaints to the HSE. You can go to the HSE Adult Safeguarding Services, which are in every community care area in the Republic of Ireland. You can, if it's an institution, you can make a report to HICWA, but just to note that HICWA don't do investigations, but they will review the concern. If it's a crime, go to the police. So there's lots of different support. Third Age run a senior helpline for older people, which are a lot of their calls are actually on abuse areas. So there are a lot of helping agencies out there, and it is about asking the question, is this person's rights being defended?
Can I ask a question? Okay.
Yeah,
Yes. I was interested in Amanda, in your definition of abuse, that you mentioned it happens to a vulnerable person. And I was wondering, is that in the moment of time, or are you talking about vulnerability more general? I thought it happened to anyone, you know.
No, abuse can happen to any of us. There's no situation where any individual is more privileged to be not being abused. So there are contextual factors, if you like, that can increase risk, and they are things like your physical and cognitive health, your environment. So we know that social isolation is a higher risk factor for abuse, and people can go in and out of vulnerability. So think of someone after bereavement of a spouse they've been living with for 50 years, and they are quite vulnerable at that point in time, particularly if it's, you know, if they had distinct roles, like the husband managed the finances, the wife managed the house, and suddenly the husband dies, and what do I do with my accounts? Things that the Banking and Payments Federation of Ireland also have taken undertaken some advice about protecting your finances. So, you know, things like joint accounts are not a good idea. Giving somebody your PIN number is not a good idea. And in fact, if money was taken from your account, the bank will not pay you back because you've signed something that says, I will not share my PIN with anyone. So all of us can be vulnerable to abuse. All of us are aging. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. You know, as you age, dementia risk increases. So what we're doing now by consolidating a human rights-based approach is also protecting ourselves.
Thank you very much indeed. That concludes today's public lecture. I'd like to say to the audience that the recording of this lecture will be available for everybody tomorrow. And again, a huge thanks to Professor Phelan for a really insightful lecture this afternoon. Thank you very much.